Good morning. Hey, thank you all for dropping in for a little bit of history this morning. And the second to the last of our hero tales. So I suppose on Thursday I'll need to have come up with a plan and announce maybe what we'll do next. But thank you all for hanging with me and enjoying this book together. I found in the last few chapters of the book that I'm finding things as well that I hadn't remembered um, and that are giving me a new view of it. So thank you for the excuse. Behind me today, you see the United States fleet steaming in 1907. And of course, on me today, I've pulled out my colonial hoodie again. This naval history session, I think, was a very important one to our authors, to Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge. There were some big things they wanted to get across with this story of Admiral Farragut at Mobile Bay. So, um, one clue to this, perhaps, is even George Washington, with our opening essay, only got 10 pages. And most of the essays have been much shorter than that. But Farragut at Mobile Bay, Roosevelt and Lodge in Hero Tales, they're giving 14 pages. That's a page a minute. So I had best hurry into going over their essay and the things they had to say. But in a way, the book, Hero Tales, has been building up to some of the lessons of Farragut at Mobile Bay. And those lessons are ones that Theodore Roosevelt is going to put into practice and live out as he gets into national strategy, first as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, just a few years after this book was published, where he was critical to planning the big naval battles of the Spanish-American War, and then as president, as a strong believer in the United States Navy. So let's head to 1864 and see where we are. And I found, I think, some nice images to share the points today. Leadership and sea power. Those are our themes today. And you remember, we have that wonderful image of the battle on the deck of a ship with the Barbary pirates and the heroism of Stephen Decatur. And we have looked at so many naval adventures so far in Hero Tales, but they've all been the size of one ship or one landing party, even. They've all been a particular man, a particular unit doing something. Now we're going to look at an admiral, at an overall commander who is not a young officer in his 20s doing sword fights, but rather a man in his 60s commanding a fleet. So let's see how our wise authors kick us off in this story. During the Civil War, they write, our Navy produced, as it has always produced, in every war, scores of capable officers, of brilliant single ship commanders, of men whose daring courage made them fit leaders in any hazardous enterprise. In this respect, the Union seamen in the Civil War merely lived up to the traditions of their service. With such glorious memories, it was a difficult thing to establish a new record in feats of personal courage or warlike address. Biddle in the Revolutionary War, fighting his little frigate against a ship of the line until she blew up with all on board. Decatur heading the rush of boarders in the night attack when they swept the wild Moorish pirates from the decks of their anchored prize. Lawrence dying with the words on his lips, "Don't give up the ship." Parry triumphantly steering his bloody sloop of war to victory with the same words blazoned on his banner. Men like these won glory in desperate conflicts with the regular warships and heavy privateers of England and France, or the corsairs of the Barbary States. So, reminder, and as they have said so many times, that great courage was simply expected of naval officers, that great daring, willingness to risk, aggressiveness, readiness to face huge odds. These are basics. And they've hammered home these basics in other stories of the book. But now they're going to go a new place. And the last couple of chapters of Hero Tales, they've emphasized technology getting better and a nation that's moving forward and has a vision for what it's going to do next. And, well, vital though daring is, other qualities are needed to fit a man for a place among the great sea captains of all time. It was the good fortune of the Navy in the Civil War to produce one admiral of renown, one peer of all the mighty men who have ever waged war on the ocean. And we see his picture there to the left, Admiral David Glasgow Farragut. Why does he attract their attention and admiration so much? David Glasgow Farragut was born in Tennessee, appointed to the Navy while living in Louisiana. But when the war came, he remained loyal to the Union flag. And they take a second here as an aside to talk about how important that was and how much they admire a Southerner appointed to the Navy from Louisiana for remaining loyally in the Union. In the South, there were a great multitude of men, as honorable as they were brave, who from the best of motives went with their states when they seceded, or even advocated secession. So they're not bashing those naval officers like Buchanan, whom we'll see again later, who went with the South. But the highest and loftiest patriots, those who deserved best to the whole country, were the men from the South who possessed such heroic courage and such lofty fealty to the high ideal of the Union that they stood by the flag when their fellows deserted it. So they have an extra shout out to Farragut here as a career naval man who has been in the United States Navy all his life for remaining with the Union. And a couple of things about his qualities here. Supreme skill and daring in his profession. He belongs to that class of commanders who possess, in the highest degree, the qualities of courage and daring, readiness to assume responsibility, willingness to run great risks. He possessed also the unwearied capacity of taking thought in advance, which enabled him to prepare for victory before the day of battle came, and an inexhaustible fertility of resource and presence of mind under no matter what the strain. Well, Farragut is going to face quite a challenge here in trying to break through and to capture Mobile Bay. And here we have a map of the entrances here, as well as the man standing there in uniform is Buchanan, the Confederate commander of the great ironclad ram, Tennessee. Buchanan, an officer who had actually been on the CSS Virginia or the Merrimack at the Battle of Hampton Roads. So he's in two of our hero tales. And these defenses of Mobile Bay. Now, the big picture is that the ports of the Confederacy are where supplies are brought in through the blockade. And this one is effectively among the last. If this port can be closed, that's going to be a big deal for the Union. In August 1864, Farragut was lying with his fleet off Mobile Bay. As for himself, all he wished was a chance to fight, for he had the fighting temperament, and he knew that in the long run, an enemy can only be beaten by being outfought, as well as outmaneuvered. He possessed a splendid self-confidence and scornfully threw aside any idea that he would be defeated. He utterly refused to be daunted by the rumors of the formidable nature of the defenses against which he was to act. I mean to be whipped or to whip the enemy, not to be scared to death. The Confederates who held Mobile used all their skill in preparing for defense and all their courage in making that defense good. The mouth of the bay was protected by two fine forts, heavily armed, Morgan and Gaines. So that makes for a crossfire with forts on either side of that bay. The winding channels were filled with torpedoes. Now, torpedoes, when they say that, they are talking about stationary mines, not what we think of as a torpedo, and not a proton torpedo from Star Wars, but rather an explosive that would be detonated when the ship bumped into it, or when a man on shore triggered a control to blow up the mine. We would later call them mines because torpedoes came to mean a self-propelled attacking device that ran by itself. But they're going to refer to those as torpedoes. That's especially important because of Farragut's famous quote from the battle, which we have to dig into a little bit later. Winding channels. It is not easy. It is not easy to navigate safely into this narrow area. They're constrained. In addition, there was a flotilla consisting of 3 gunboats and, above all, a big ironclad ram, the Tennessee, one of the most formidable vessels then afloat. She was not fast, but she carried 6 high-power rifled guns, and her armor was very powerful. While being of light draft, she could take a position where Farragut's deep-sea ships could not get at her. So, he's facing great odds here at Mobile Bay, and heading in, he comes up with a plan. Let's see. I think we can see it more clearly in a later slide. Give me a second. I got these a bit out of order, I suppose. All right, you see the double column of ships here? And there are ironclads on one side. You see there are ironclads on one side here. And the sailing ships on the outside, sort of away from the fort on shore. Trying to get my spotlight to work. You'll see that? That is part of his plan. Farragut made his attack with 4 monitors. And we learned about the monitor at the Battle of Hampton Roads. but it was a successful design, so the North made a lot of them. And that was a difference between what the North could do and what the South could do. If the North made a successful advanced ship like the Monitor and it worked out fine, then they could mass produce them. And so monitors became rather common in the Union Navy. 4 monitors, 2 of them, the Tecumseh and the Manhattan, of large size, carrying 15 guns, the other 2 smaller, and wooden vessels, 14 in number. 7 of these were big sloops of war, including Farragut's own flagship, a screw steamer, but was a full-rigged ship likewise, with 22 9-inch shell guns arranged in broadside and a crew of 300 men. The other 7 were light gunboats. When Farragut prepared for the assault, he arranged to make the attack with his wooden ships in double column. And we see here, let's back up a bit. They're going to move in double column. And in fact, because we've already learned how dangerous the ironclads are to the wooden ships, not to mention the forts firing on the wooden ships, the 7 most powerful were formed on the right in line ahead to engage Fort Morgan, the heaviest of the 2 forts. The light vessels were lashed, each one to the left of one of the heavier ones. So as in that other picture where we saw the ironclads in between the wooden ships in the fort, the wooden ships were lashed together, the idea being that if one ship was crippled and its engine not working, or that it was disabled, rendered helpless, it says, by a shot in the boiler or other vital part of the machinery, the other ship's power could still continue to move it out of danger and out of the way. In a narrow channel, if one of these ships is made helpless, the others would be blocked by it. So it's like making sure that each ship had double engines to lash 2 together like that. He waited to deliver the attack until the tide and the wind should be favorable, and made all his preparations with the utmost care and thoughtfulness. Preeminently a man who could inspire affection in others, both the officers and men of the fleet regarded him with fervent loyalty and absolute trust. So our man Farragut here, Roosevelt and Lodge are making a major point that he planned carefully. He used clever and new tactics to get in, that he was a man who thought ahead, and that it had become a nation which thought ahead, producing the fleet, including the brand new ironclads that he could use effectively. That's important, because the most famous quote of Admiral Farragut, the quote that is still memorized by every freshman at the U.S. Naval Academy, there's a list of historic quotes of great leaders that they remember, that they memorize. And the quote, which is going to be remembered from Admiral Farragut, is, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." And he said that. But out of context, it sounds like a quote of recklessness. It sounds like his personality, his leadership was, ignore the obstacles and charge. His leadership is actually a little bit better demonstrated earlier that morning. The whole tone. At 3 a.m., the Admiral learned a light breeze had sprung up from the quarter he wished, and he at once announced, "Then we will go in the morning." At daybreak, he was at breakfast when the word was brought that the ships were all lashed in couples. Turning quietly to his captain, he said, "Well, Drayton, we might as well be underway." And at 6:30, the monitors stood down to their station. Every man in every craft was thrilling with the fierce excitement of battle. But in the minds of most, there lurked a vague feeling of unrest over one danger. For their foes who fought in sight, the forts, the gunboats, the great ironclad ram, they cared nothing. But all, save the very boldest, were at times awed and rendered uneasy by the fear of the hidden and the unknown, the mines of death, which lay they knew not where, thickly scattered through the channels, along which they were to thread their way. Farragut stood in the port main rigging, and as the smoke increased, he gradually climbed higher until he was close by the maintop, where the pilot was stationed. The captain, fearing lest by one of the accidents of battle the great admiral should lose his footing, set a man aloft, a man with a lasher, and had a turn or two taken around his body in the shrouds. In other words, he tied him up into the rigging, so if the admiral slipped and fell or was wounded, that he would be caught. Because again, this is a 60-year-old man climbing way up into the rigging. The shots were flying thick. They have the first skirmish with the Confederate ships, and then move past them into the harbor. The Monitor Tecumseh alone was silent. After firing the first two shots, her commander had loaded his two big guns with steel shot, reserved himself for the Confederate ironclad. Captain Craven of the Tecumseh wants his shot at the main enemy vessel. He doesn't get that. The two columns pressed on without hesitation, but just at this moment, a terrible calamity befell the lead of the monitors. The Tecumseh, standing straight for the Tennessee, was within 200 yards of her foe when a torpedo suddenly exploded beneath her. The Monitor was about 500 yards from the Hartford, and from the maintop, Farragut saw her reel violently from side to side, lurch heavily over, and go down, head foremost, her screw, or propeller, revolving wildly in the air as she disappeared. Captain Craven, one of the gentlest and bravest of men, was in the pilot house with the pilot at the time. As she sank, both rushed to the narrow door, but there was time for only one to get out. Craven was ahead, but he drew to one side, saying, "After you, pilot." As the pilot leaped through, the water rushed in. Craven and all his crew, save two men, settled to the bottom in their iron coffin. So, the destruction of that Monitor by a torpedo is something the rest of the fleet has seen. And this causes dismay. They're ready to call it off at that point. In fact, the commander of the ship, the Brooklyn, stopped his ship. And this, they say in the essay, was the crisis of the fight and the crisis of Farragut's career. The crisis is, will the fleet lose its nerve? Will they not press home the attack because they've just lost one ship to a torpedo? Will mines destroy more of the fleet? Will the fear of mines keep the fleet from going forward? It is at this time that Farragut makes his great quote. Ahead lay terrible danger, but ahead lay also triumph. It might be that the first ship to go through would be sacrificed to the torpedoes. It might be that others would be sacrificed, but go through the fleet must. Farragut signaled to the Brooklyn to go ahead, but she still hesitated. Immediately, the admiral himself resolved to take the lead. Backing hard, he got clear of the Brooklyn, twisted his ship's prow short round, and then going ahead fast, he dashed close under the Brooklyn's stern, straight at the line of buoys in the channel. As he thus went by the Brooklyn, a warning cry came from her that there were torpedoes ahead. "Damn the torpedoes," shouted the admiral. "Go ahead, full speed." And the Hartford and her consort steamed forward. As they passed between the buoys, the cases of the torpedoes were heard, knocking against the bottom of the ship, but for some reason, they failed to explode, and the Hartford went safely through the gates of Mobile Bay, passing the forts. Farragut's last and hardest battle was virtually won. Despite the destruction of the first Monitor Inn, the fleet won through. And although the Battle of Mobile Bay is effectively over at that point, there's still a final act in the play. Buchanan, the Confederate commander, is in charge of the Great Ram, Tennessee. A very gallant and able officer who had been on the Merrimac and who trusted implicitly in his invulnerable sides, his heavy rifled guns, and his formidable iron beak. As the Ram came on with splendid courage, the ships got underway. Farragut sent word to the monitors to attack the Tennessee at once. The monitors were very slow, and the wooden vessels began to attack. The first to reach the hostile ironclad was the Monongahela, which struck her square amidships. 5 minutes later, the Lackawanna, going at full speed, delivered another heavy blow. Both the Union vessels fired such guns as would bear as they swung around. The shots glanced harmlessly from the armor, and the blows of the ships produced no serious injury to the ram, although their own stems were crushed in several feet above and below the waterline. We have a close-up of what became a fight of a single ironclad surrounded by and fighting with the whole fleet. The Hartford's guns were discharged against the ram, their muzzles only half a dozen feet distant from her ironclad sides, but the shot made no impression. Meanwhile, the monitors had come up, and the battle raged between them and the great ram. Like the rest of the Union fleet, they carried smoothbores, and their shot could not break through her iron plates, but by sustained and continuous hammering, her frame could be jarred and her timbers displaced. Two of the monitors had been more or less disabled already, but the third was in fine trim, and Perkins got her into position under the stern of the Tennessee. There he stuck to the end, never over 50 yards distant, and keeping up a steady rapping of 11-inch shot upon the iron walls, which they could not penetrate, but they racked and shattered. The Chickasaw fired 52 times at her antagonist, shooting away the exposed rudder chains and the smokestack, while the commander of the ram, Buchanan, was wounded by an iron splinter which broke his leg. Under the hammering, the Tennessee became helpless. She could not be steered, was unable to bring a gun to bear, while many of the shutters of the ports were jammed. For 20 minutes, she had not fired a shot. The wooden vessels were again bearing down to ram her, and she hoisted the white flag. Thus ended the Battle of Mobile Bay, Farragut's crowning victory. So we do have here one of those feats of a single captain and great individual daring. But it's on the other side, and it is defeated. And Roosevelt and Lodge have some pretty big takeaways for us today. And they're things that are going to be reflected in their lives and in their teachings as they go on to be important leaders. Our takeaways today: the daring and courage wins glory and should be honored and respected. And he honors and respects the daring and courage of Buchanan, who is fighting all by himself in that one ironclad ship against an entire fleet. But that they're not enough. In fact, this is a passage from earlier in the essay about Farragut. His whole career should be taught every American schoolboy. For when that schoolboy becomes a voter, he should have learned the lesson that the United States, while it ought not to become an overgrown military power, should always have a first class navy, formidable from its number of ships and formidable still more for the excellence of the individual ships and the high character of the officers and men. Farragut had seen the War of 1812, in which, though our few frigates and sloops fought some glorious actions, our coasts were blockaded and insulted, and the capital of Washington burned, because our statesmen and our people had been too short-sighted to build a big fighting navy. And Farragut was able to perform his great feats on the Gulf Coast because when the Civil War broke out, we had a navy, which, too small in point of numbers, was composed of ships as good as any afloat. Another lesson to be learned by a study of his career, our authors write, is that no man in a profession so highly technical as the Navy can win a great success unless he's been brought up in and specially trained for that profession and has devoted his life to the work. This fact was made plainly evident in the desperate hurly-burly of the night battle with the Confederate flotilla below New Orleans. So, professionalism, professional officers of the Navy, that is something that they believe really needs to be added. Not just courage, but careful study and practice of strategy and using technology and leadership and all the other things that go into making a great naval officer, as well as forethought. They emphasize Farragut's forethought. They want the whole nation to have forethought as well, because you can't decide to build a navy in a hurry and have it right there. Your navy has to be ready already when the crisis comes. This is a fact, they write, which may well be pondered by the ignorant or unpatriotic people who believe the United States does not need a navy, or that it can improvise one and improvise officers to handle it whenever a moment of need arises. So national forethought is something they want as well. And when Theodore Roosevelt becomes president, he's going to be famous for his peacetime naval buildup and use of what was called the Great White Fleet. And this is a beautiful photograph of the battleships and heavy cruisers of the Great White Fleet, an American naval flotilla, which would actually go all the way around the world, would circumnavigate the globe to show the world that we had an effective, professional, first-rate navy, that it could go anywhere, and that because of that, the United States should have international respect. So he's been building up the whole book to the leadership of the great Admiral Farragut at Mobile Bay. And I found it interesting how this final essay ties into the big picture that Roosevelt and Lodge have of national strategy, that history illustrates and guides how they thought the nation ought to behave. Oh, a chat message. That my mic feed was bad every so often. I hope y'all didn't miss too much. Thank you for joining me this morning. I did go past 9:30 this time, but it was 14 pages. And thank you all for hanging with me during this series of talks out of Hero Tales. Our final hero tale is Roosevelt and Lodge writing about their political hero, Our final hero tale will be Thursday morning at 9 o'clock, and our subject will be Abraham Lincoln.